Hi there, this is Solitarian Films, and welcome to another Top 10 video. And seeing it's Easter, I thought I would be topical and festive and do a Top 10 vampire films. The vampire myth has kind of lasted a very long time and is still popular. And I think it's mainly for two reasons. One, the idea of having the power over death and not dying, because as somebody once said, as soon as you're born you're dying, and vampires don't have to worry about dying, even though, to be fair, as soon as they get into a film then they have to worry about dying, because they do seem to die quite a lot in films. And the second reason is the fact that you can do pretty much what you want when you're a vampire, within reason obviously, and various films have different rules, like sunlight or crosses or holy water or silver, but in general you can party all night and never grow old and have tremendous fun, which is something that we would all quite like to do. And then from a filmmaking point of view, I think the vampire mythos is a good subject matter because it can go in so many different directions, and certainly in this top 10 there's kind of different versions of the vampire story. And it's funny because this was actually one of the harder top 10s, just because there's so many of them, and again, this being an interactive channel, please leave me your top 10 vampire films. So I'm going to go through actually a pile of films that didn't make the final list, but I kind of felt like I had to kind of talk about them anyway, so unfortunately you're stuck with them. So let's begin, shall we? So the first one is a kind of philosophical vampire film, and it's Abel Ferrara's The Diction with Lily Taylor and Christopher Walken. Obviously I'm biased because Christopher Walken, even though he's only in a cameo and he's only in the film for about 10 minutes, but he's absolutely fantastic. It's black and white. It was shot around the same time as The Funeral, which unfortunately isn't available in Blu-ray, sadly, but should be. So The Diction is a really good dark vampire film, and again it's more about philosophy and the nature of evil, and it's really good. And the next one is probably a complete polar opposite. It's Mr. Vampire. So this is the Hong Kong knockabout comedy version of the vampire tale. There are 3 Mr. Vampires, even though sadly I've only seen the first one. This is a lovely Nova Media edition of it, but this is tremendous fun. I think I saw this when I was young, late night on BBC Two, as was the way BBC Two was in the good old days of the 80s and 90s, where they would put on foreign films in the middle of the night. Next one that didn't make it in, the two Count Yorga films. These are from the 1970s, and these kind of have a riff on the Hammer films and would kind of inspire the Hammer films like Dracula 1972 AD. They're fun films. I actually prefer the second one in this set, but they're fun 70s vampire films. The next one, you can argue whether it is or whether it isn't a vampire film. This is Life Force, and this is the space vampire version of the vampire story. This is Tobe Hooper, and it's one of the most barking films of the 80s. Next is the comic book vampire. This is the Blade trilogy. With Blade 2, Guillermo del Toro. Blade, I feel, could have been a lot better with a better villain rather than Stephen Dorff. I don't know, maybe somebody like Christopher Walken. The next one is the musical vampire film. This is Billy the Kid and the Green Bay's Vampire, which I recently did a random review of because I just had to talk about it because it's a musical and it's quite incredible, directed by Alan Clark. The next one is Vamp with Grace Jones, and this is the college sex comedy vampire film. The next one is Alucarda, or if you put the name in a mirror, you get the idea. This is part witch, part vampire film from Mexico, and it's quite barking. It's made in the 70s, so it's allowed to be. The next ones that didn't get in, it's the Japanese version of the vampire mythos. This is the Bloodthirsty trilogy, which is the Vampire Doll, Lake of Dracula, and Evil of Dracula. These are the Toho. I think my favourites are probably Evil of Dracula and the Vampire Doll. This is a nice arrow set. And then we have the spoof Spinal Tap vampire version, What We Do in the Shadows. Taika Waititi's fantastic, just really funny documentary following vampires in New Zealand. That's well worth a watch. And finally, one which I really wanted to put in the top 10 but I couldn't quite do it. It's Blackula, with its sequel Scream Blackula Scream. Again, these are 70s. This is the blaxploitation vampire story. And as I recently found out watching the extras on the Count Yorga collection, both Blackula and Count Yorga come to America on the same boat. Let's get the same name, because they were made for American International, who didn't have a lot of money. They pretty much used the same footage of the boat. So it's just this lovely idea of this cruise company that transports vampires to America in the 70s. It's wonderful. Blackula is a great film. William Marshall. Okay, it's maybe not a great film. It's a great 70s film. William Marshall's a wonderful Blackula. He has dignity, and you're completely on his side, because the film opens in Transylvania. Count Dracula has William Marshall over with his wife as guests, and then it turns out Dracula is a bit of a git and is favour of slavery, and ends up pinching William Marshall's wife and turning him into a vampire. So you're immediately on Blackula's side. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it, because it's actually quite moving at the end. And like I said, you're on Blackula's side. So that's the films that didn't make it into the top 10. And again, you can see even within that list there is a range of styles and types. So continuing with the theme, let's start at number 10. And this is Shadow of the Vampire, I beg your pardon. This is a really nice film. This is one that for some reason I hadn't seen before. I remember it coming out in the cinema. What year is this? In the 90s? Or maybe the turn of the millennium. But it's wonderful. It's about the making of Nosferatu by F.W. Murnau. I don't think it's based on fact, but you never know. It's pretty much the premise of, what if Max Schreck, who plays Nosferatu, who plays Count Orlok, because they weren't allowed to use the actual name Dracula, what if he actually was a vampire? And this stars John Malkovich as Murnau and Willem Dafoe as Max Schreck or Count Orlok. It also stars Eddie Izzard as the not very good German actor who essentially plays the straight man, and also Udo Kier, who himself has been in a fair number of vampire films, and it's just fantastic. You do find yourself wanting to watch Nosferatu as soon as you've watched The Shadow of the Vampire, but not in the sense of, oh, I want to watch the better version or anything. It's just to kind of, because they recreate so many scenes from Nosferatu that you just want to go and watch it again just to watch those scenes. Willem Dafoe is fantastic. He's funny, he's creepy. Yeah, and John Malkovich as Murnau, who is dedicated and just wants to, this obsession with finishing his film, even though the money men are at his back, and certain things happen during the production that kind of put the film in jeopardy, but regardless of what the cost, money wise or in human life, he still wants to finish it. It's a beautiful film, it's a low budget film, but it's a tremendous amount of fun, and certainly for cinephiles it's a great film because you're always thinking about Nosferatu itself. So that's number 10, Shadow of the Vampire, which again I can't believe it took me so long to actually watch, but since buying it I've watched it about 3 times. So number 9 is George Romero's Martin. Now this is it actually a vampire film? This is low budget. It could also be in a serial killer top 10, I think. It's about a young man called Martin who has issues. He has issues around women, relating to women, or as he puts it, dealing with the sexiness dealing with the sexy stuff he has problems with, so he tends to drug them and be intimate with them, not necessarily in a sexual way, just to be near them and just to feel them next to him, because he doesn't feel like he can actually do that in real life. And he goes to stay with his uncle, who is convinced that Martin is a vampire. He's convinced that the whole family has this curse that goes back generations, and it has manifested itself in Martin, and it's up to the uncle to either contain him and control him, or destroy him. And it's a really interesting film. Again, this is one that I hadn't seen for some reason. I do think this is the Arrow DVD, but I do think Second Sight are possibly releasing a Blu-ray of this. It's a real interesting film. Obviously it's low budget, but it's not hamstrung by that, or hamstrung by the kind of not famous acting. It stands up really well. I think it was 1978, so it's over 40 years old now. But as a character study and as a kind of psychological examination of, you know, that kind of character who can't deal with women when they're conscious, and it's easier to deal with women when you drug them. Obviously we've all thought that from time to time. It's a really interesting film, and it leaves it kind of open with, is he a vampire, is he not a vampire, is he just a disturbed individual, or is he actually Nosferatu? So number 8, again, is a completely different tact. It's The Lost Boys. It has to be The Lost Boys. It's 80s, it's cheesy. I saw this in the cinema. Again, it shows vampires to be fun. You hang out in an abandoned carnival on a tectonic plate which could be thrown into the earth with an earthquake. You get to eat maggots, order Chinese food, listen to cheesy's 80s rock and roll. It's just tremendous fun. For me, there's different people who would prefer perhaps Fright Night to The Lost Boys, for that kind of 80s fun. But for me, I've always had a soft spot for The Lost Boys. Even though bizarrely I've never seen the second or third Lost Boys, and I don't really want to. Plus it has one of the best last lines in cinema history. It's great support, Edward Herrmann and Diane Wiest as the mother of Jason Patrick, and Corey Haim, and of course Corey Feldman makes an appearance as one of the Frog Brothers, vampire hunters. It's just tremendous fun. You can call it a guilty pleasure if you like, but Lost Boys is number 8. So number 7, again, completely different tact. It's Jim Jarmusch's Only Lovers Left Alive, which gives me another excuse just to show off the plain archive edition, which is gorgeous. Only Lovers Left Alive is one of my favourite films in the last 15 years. It's just absolutely beautiful. and sumptuous and romantic. It stars Tilda Swinton and that bloke from the Avengers, Tom Hiddleston, as Adam and Eve, who are fairly old vampires, and it really kind of brings up one of the points of vampirism that's maybe forgotten about, is the fact if you've lived that long, just think of the art and the music that you can actually experience, and the writing. So again, Jarmusch being Jarmusch, it's from a completely different angle than everybody else treats vampire films. His zombie film, Dead Don't Die, which is out in cinemas in June, is maybe looks a little bit more traditional as far as the zombie film, but his vampire film is just an absolute treat. If you know Jarmusch, the score is wonderful. It's has its own pace. They get their blood from blood banks. There's no stakes through the heart or people being savagely attacked. It's all very sedate, it's very classy, and it's just one of the best films of the last 15 years. So that's Only Lovers Left Alive at 7. At number 6 is the remake vampire film. It's Nosferatu the Vampire by Werner Herzog, which is on this collection box set. It's funny, out of the top 10, the word Nosferatu does seem to be appearing quite a lot. It's funny that. This was made in 1979, and it's Klaus Kinski as Nosferatu, who gives just a wonderful performance. He's animalistic, he's sad, he talks about time being an abyss, and again it's full of that kind of German dread, and kind of fear of the power of the universe. It opens up with shots of mummified corpses. There's lots of beautiful scenes near the end of the film with coffins and rats. Herzog takes long shots of mountains and rivers and the power of water. Bruno Ganz is wonderful as Jonathan Harker, who goes to meet Nosferatu in his castle, with the standard story of Nosferatu is going to be a neighbour of his. It's got an unusual ending, or it doesn't kind of end the way the typical kind of Nosferatu Dracula film ends. Isabella Gianni is wonderful as well as Harker's wife, who's actually strong, and she's the one who is determined to save her husband and defeat Klaus Kinski. And Van Helsing is actually quite weak and doesn't believe her, and he's the man of science, but he comes across as actually being a bit weak, and she's actually the strong one. It's beautifully shot. Herzog probably is the only person who could remake a classic and actually make it his own, and make it similar but different. There's just haunting images and great performances. Again, some people might find it slow, but it's just, once you fall under its spell, it's just an absolute treat. So that's Nosferatu the Vampire by Herzog. And the next one is back to the 80s. This is the cowboy vampire film. This is Near Dark, which I think is Catherine Bigelow's best film, but that's just me. Again, there's not a lot of sharp teeth involved in this, or flying, or stakes, or anything like that. There's no Van Helsing character. This is a story of boy meets girl. Girl happens to be a vampire, and she has an unusual vampire family. And the boy ends up being embroiled with them, and then eventually trying to get free of them with the girl. This has a wonderful cast from Aliens, so Jeanette Goldstein, Lance Henriksen, and Bill Paxton, who is just having a blast as Severin. Again, it's dirty, it's grimy, it's almost a road movie, it's dark, it's just a blast. That is essentially a cowboy movie. There's a great set piece in a bar where they're trying to get Adrian Pastor's character to finally kill somebody and actually join the group properly, and that's just a wonderful set piece. It's quite bloody. The film has a wonderful score with Tangerine Dream, and it's just great 80s fun. Near Dark and Lost Boys both came out about 1987, but Near Dark kind of went more straight to video, even though it's actually the better film, because I remember seeing it in video. So again, that's over 40 years ago. Time flies. Yeah, so Near Dark, next on the list. So this is another different vampire film. This is Kronos, Guillermo del Toro's fantastic debut. This is the Criterion Blu-ray, spine number 551 for those Criterion aficionados. And this is a beautiful film. I mean, personally I think Devil's Backbone is his best film, but this isn't that far off. Again, the word vampire isn't used in this one. It's about Federico Luppi, or Lippi. Yeah, he turns Luppi, and he finds this device that seems to rejuvenate him. I'm not going to go too much into the details of it. Also stars Ron Perlman as the nephew of this old man who's desperate to get this device because his time on Earth is running out. And like all Del Toro films, it's about the family unit. So you have the doctor and his wife and his granddaughter, this little girl. You have the nephew and the uncle. So sometimes his family units are twisted and they don't actually work, but his films are generally about that, and also about monsters, and monsters as not necessarily victims, but monsters as, you know, sympathetic or empathetic characters. And in this one, it's definitely not cool to be a vampire. There's a price to be paid for rejuvenation. There's a price to be paid for potential immortality. it's a wonderful film. It's really assured for a first feature, and it's highly recommended. That's Kronos. At number 3, it's 30 Days of Night, which is again another comic book adaptation, but this ain't Blade. This is vampires back to being more animalistic, being more vicious, being more visceral, being an unstoppable force. The trick with 30 Days at Night, one of the great things about vampires is allegedly in daylight you're safe. So as soon as dawn comes, how many vampire films, everybody breathes a sigh of relief, it's dawn, here comes the daylight. Well, 30 Days a Night is set in Barrow, Alaska, where there's 30 days of night, so there's no escape, which is a really nice twist. So vampires come to a small town and annihilate it. The vampires again are vicious and horrible and kind of have their own language of screeches and wails, and Josh Hartnett and Melissa George are an estranged police couple trying to survive. It's got great sound design, great production design. It's a film that I've probably seen about 20 times. It's just eminently rewatchable. There's characters you believe, characters you root for. Granted, the lead vampire, played by Danny Houston, is maybe not the greatest. Granted, he does have a couple of fantastic lines. And it's just tremendous fun. Number 3. So number 2, again, is a film that I hadn't seen until relatively recently, bizarrely, to my shame. Abusive comments below. But when I saw it, one, I thought, why have I not seen this before, a lot sooner? Because it blew me away. And it's Carol Theodore Dreyer's Vampire from 1932. This is a Criterion Blu-ray, which, if you have a multi-region player, I highly recommend. It also has a book. Yeah, I mean, this is stunning. And I know it's kind of a cliche to say, oh, it's Lynchian. You know, if you watch Vampire and then watch Eraserhead, and I know David Lynch doesn't seem to be influenced by other filmmakers or other films, but he must have seen Vampire at some point in his life. It's set in kind of the 20s, so it's kind of normal or kind of recognisable clothing as this guy goes into the country to investigate strange goings on, but with the use of camera tricks and just stunning cinematography. Dreyer transports you into this dream world, and it is like a dream or a terrible nightmare, one of the two. It's just beautiful. It's one of those films that's probably perfect. The shots that will stick in your head for life. It's such a great film. but it's only number 2. Because number 1, it's predictable, but it's Nosferatu by Murnau. I guess it's fitting that the top 10 was kind of bookended with Shadow the Vampire, which is a fictional making of Nosferatu. It's fitting that in the middle, Herzog had his remake of Nosferatu, but this is Murnau's astonishing 1922 film, which at times it feels almost like a documentary. At times it feels like a waking nightmare. It's just has iconic scenes. It has obviously the basic story of Dracula, even though they couldn't actually call it Dracula, so it's it's Count Orlok. Again, the use of different camera speeds. I should say this Eureka Massive Cinema print is absolutely beautiful. The different colours they use and the tinting. Yeah, I mean it's difficult to try and explain because it is the basic story. Harker goes to sell a house, things happen, the ship comes to the town carrying the plague, strange things happen. So the actual bare bones of the basic kind of Dracula or Nosferatu story, there's not actually that much there. But again, it's about control. A lot of it in the early forms was about kind of sexual taboos. It's just a wonderful film, and as it closes in its 100th year, it still stands up. Yeah, I can't really say much about Nosferatu apart from it's fantastic, and if you haven't seen it, prepare to be impressed. And yes, it's a silent film. Yes, some of the acting is obviously German expressionistic, so there's lots of arm movements. But at its core, it's just beautiful and still creepy and still slightly disturbing, especially if you believe the Shadow of a Vampire and he actually was a vampire. So thanks very much for watching. That took quite a while. I apologise for the length of the video, but it's actually something you realise you have a lot more vampire films than you actually think you do. And please leave comments down below. Leave me your top 10, because I'm always interested to see people's comments. And thank you very much for watching. I hope you survived, and I hope you survived the weekend. This is Solitude saying farewell, and hopefully we'll see you again.